always used to lay you clean up the messes. Down on my knees, thought I couldn't stand up on my own. Turns out sometimes you're stronger alone.
My name is Arthur. I'm 43 years old, and I have been shunned.
All right, Arthur. So I know you were one of Jehovah's Witnesses. So how did you end up being one in the first place, or how were you introduced to it?
Well, I was actually multi-generational. So going back many generations on both sides of my family, all Jehovah's Witnesses, all the way down. At least that's the way that it was presented to me. I found out later it wasn't exactly as it had been presented. But I was born in, my dad was an elder the entire time growing up, and that was my experience.
Okay. Any family lore or anything as to like how it got started in your family? Sometimes there's an inciting incident that brings this into one's family.
My perception of that growing up was that we were always in. There was no inciting incident story that was ever shared. My great-grandmother, who during my lifetime was kind of the matriarch of my dad's side of the family, she was JW, and as far as I'm aware, we were always JW. My dad's family is from upstate New York, so very close geographically to the inception. But no, I've never kind of researched to see, if we got converted by the Rutherfords, for example. I have no visibility to that.
Understood. So since this was all you ever knew, being born into it, and you have this long lineage of it being present in your family, what did it mean to you growing up in it? What kind of worldview did you have? How did it make you see life around you and yourself?
Well, it's really interesting, and it's really hard for me to distinguish because I had for myself kind of an inciting incident when I was fairly young. I have a sister who's about 10 years older than me, and she left home and left the church when she was 16. So at 6 years old, I was confronted by the reality of shunning, which was obviously very complicated, very confusing for someone who was not even really in school yet in any meaningful way. And that was kind of the light bulb moment for me when I realized that there was a conflict between God is love and God doesn't want me to talk to my big sister anymore. So that was very confusing. And that was kind of what popped the soap bubble of the reality that they had constructed.
Wow. Out of the mouth of babes, as they say, a 6-year-old is not going, it is going to be simple enough to not have been confused enough to see that shunning is not love. It's just not loving to kick somebody to the curb, and especially not your you said 16-year-old sister?
That's correct.
Wow. So she was young herself.
Yes, very young. And she had her own complex journey. We reconnected later in life, and I was able to learn a little bit more about it. But it was very affecting for me. And one of the early traumas that I experienced related to the Jehovah's Witness faith.
I can totally understand why that would be difficult. What was in your 6-year-old head? Can you remember kind of the thoughts and feelings that you may have had as a young person seeing this? And I don't know, was she still in the house or around at any point where you?
Oh no, it was very much a my house, my rules kind of environment. And so when she left, she never came back. I think maybe she came back once during that first year. But when she was gone, she was gone. My dad, even for the Jehovah's Witness faith, with him being an elder, he was a very authoritarian individual, very my way or the highway. And so, had she chosen to return in any meaningful way, it would have been deeply unpleasant for her. And I think that she knew that and was willing to make some personal sacrifices in order to avoid that situation.
That Makes a lot of sense as well. Were you, did anybody talk to you about it? Like, did your sister just disappear and you're just a 6-year-old wondering, where is my sister? Or were you talked to about this in some way, not just to promote the rules and you following them, but to help you in any real way?
So it certainly wasn't intended to help me in any way. My parents were very clearly experiencing their own trauma related to it. My mom in particular, it was very clear that she was having a complex emotional experience related to it. They didn't unpack it for me with the intention of, helping me process in any meaningful way. They did explain to me that essentially that my sister had abandoned us, had abandoned Jehovah, which is classic positioning for them. But beyond that, it was really just wouldn't it be nice if she returned to Jehovah, if she started living right, that type of messaging. So that from a very early stage, the onus was placed on her for leaving, not on the organization for performing the shunning.
Classic victim blaming of the organization. That's what they do.
Yep, exactly right.
Prevalent.
Exactly right. But to answer kind of what I see as the crux of the question, I was absolutely left to navigate the entire emotional experience on my own. And, it did some damage during that time and contributed to some maladaptive behaviors that it took many, many years to unlearn.
Understood. Do you care to share any of those behaviors that other people may experience as well when they've been gone through something like this?
So because of the dichotomy between my learned experience and what I had been taught through the church, one of the most complicated and damaging things was actually what they would refer to as living a double life. I think that that's probably a pretty common term, where I had one lifestyle and social group that was the approved social group, but I really kind of craved authentic, organic social connections. Of course, one of the de facto results of being a Jehovah's Witness is social isolation, social ostracization, especially for kids, right? You have kids in a public school system who aren't participating in holidays, not able to socialize conventionally, not able to participate in, a lot of the standard activities, and kids pick up on that, and kids aren't always nice. I think that's probably a pretty generous way of saying it.
Yes, it is.
And so what that did is it kind of created for me this desire to bond socially with my true peers, while also having this hyper vigilant awareness of the fact that I was being observed by the Jehovah's Witness agents, perhaps, in the public school system. And so I had to be really, really, really aware of how I managed all of my social relationships. I, experienced a lot of and this is all like pre-junior high, going into junior high. A lot of self-loathing, a lot of, I think that one component is because JWs are so unilateral in the way that they present reality, I had to do a lot of work around carving out my own reality and kind of trying to understand how much of what I am being presented is actually true. Let me give you an example. And this is a great example of the immature thinking that I had at that age, which was that I knew that it wasn't loving to shun my sister. However, I still believed in the Jehovah's Witness version of the Bible and of theology. So I'm sitting there, 8 years old, 10 years old, thinking, well, if God wants me to not talk to my sister, then I don't want anything to do with God. So I'm going to go see what Satan is up to. And so like at 10 years old, I didn't have the terminology for it, but I was functionally a theistic Satanist thinking, okay, Satan, please help me because I'm in so much pain in this situation. And Jehovah isn't doing anything about it. Jehovah's the one who created the situation. You're probably not that bad a guy, enemy of my enemy style scenario.
Sure.
Clearly, that's a very immature view. But an example of some of the maladaptive behavior is that I was in my own mind, doing this other thing. As time went on and the abuse within the family of origin, within the organization continued, there were mental health issues that cropped up. Sometimes ones that I didn't really have the vocabulary to talk about, and certainly not the tools to be able to work on.
Oh, of course, of course.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very damaging environment. It hurts. It's just not healthy. I mean, you're a 6-year-old having to shun your 16-year-old sister. On what planet is that healthy? That's just abnormal, aberrant behavior. So what was your family of origin like? What kind of family did you grow up in? Were you all, obviously this is focused on the experience in the organization to some degree, but what kind of family were you guys? What was the temperature of the room? Did you all go do fun things? Or?
So we grew up camping and fishing. I would say that much of that experience was also kind of tainted by the high control nature. Both of my folks are also abuse survivors, independent of the organization's abuse. And so I kind of got a double whammy being raised in an extremely rural area in a small town and in the organization. It was kind of a perfect storm for not just the high control of the organization, but also of my folks' own maladaptive behaviors and kind of desires for control. So the environment itself was not what I would call positive. There was a lot of complexity. I was not a super happy kid for obvious reasons. When I think back to my childhood, probably the fondest memories, apart from when I was mobile enough to be able to get out of the situation and spend more time in nature, were the times when I would be with my family in nature. And like something like camping, you don't have to worry about going out in field ministry and the shame that's associated with contacting your peers. I didn't have to worry about, being at a meeting where everyone is under a microscope. None of that was on my mind, and I was able to kind of just enjoy a more pure experience in a way I wasn't always able to.
Sure, I can imagine why that would be. So then was your family at home, were you all the studious family, that did the daily text every day, that was doing the family study? Were you all super involved?
Yes, absolutely. So we never missed a meeting for anything other than the best reasons. Never missed field ministry, daily study, not just, the daily scriptural reading, reasoning from the scriptures, I think it was called. I haven't thought about that publication in a million years.
And then
daily text. Yeah. Absolutely. Every single day, reading and discussion, involved studies like family study before each meeting. And it was absolutely a central component of our lives, not just in terms of lifestyle, but in terms of the academics behind it as well.
Yeah.
My dad was an elder and had been for many years, and I was being groomed to be a circuit overseer or a district overseer. So they took my theological education really, really seriously.
What was it that led you to know they were grooming you to be such an overseer? I'm sure they said that at some point, but I mean, was there was there any precedent for it in your family? What was it that they thought would get you there?
I so there wasn't a precedent for it in the family. There were many elders in the family. However, it was really about kind of cementing that family dynasty in the church, I feel. But also, I think that they identified in me or perhaps projected onto me, a certain level of ease with communicating to large groups of people, managing groups of people. And I think that that was likely part of it, but it was really, I think, more what they wanted for me.
Yeah, I found that interesting that it was circuit overseer slash district overseer when Bethel is the typical.
Oh yeah, they wanted me to go there first.
Oh, they wanted you to go there first.
Yeah, the classic pipeline.
Yeah.
When I turned 18, they wanted me to go to Bethel and then come back and serve in the local congregation, and
and then eventually go on to do that.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
And is it something that you ever expressed interest in of your own volition? Just because obviously there would be some coercion there, but I mean, is it something that you ever expressed interest in, or was that just really their dream for you?
Yeah, my recollection of it is that I never commented on that unprompted. Pretty much from my awakening at about 6, I stopped volunteering that I wanted to pursue those types of activities because I really didn't. If there was a situation that presented itself where it was really clear that that was the social expectation, that I should come back and say, oh yeah, I really want to XYZ, I would do that in order to fly under the radar. But in terms of like a truly unprompted desire to have anything to do with the organization, that was absolutely absent. And I think that with hindsight and plenty of therapy, that era of my life was probably the most damaging because I had a therapist who explained it to me that it was a de facto imprisonment because I wanted to be free and I could not be.
Well, it is. It's a de facto imprisonment, and you see some people become institutionalized.
100%.
And others want to leave and never go back in any way, shape, or form. Don't yearn for any part of it necessarily. It's definitely a prison environment. So, and I, it's such a tough thing. I always feel for sometimes on the ex-JW Reddit or maybe someone that I run into in my coaching practice, whatever. But anytime you hear of a child or you see a child on an ex-JW Reddit or forum who's 12 years old and they already know this is not where they want to be.
Yeah,
that's just a really tough next 6 years at least. Of
I would
trying
say
to figure it out. It's really hard.
Absolutely. Sorry for cutting you off there. Yeah, 100%. And those ages are hard enough for anyone.
Yes.
And then you stack this on top of it, being in or out, and then, being physically in and mentally out, going through adolescence. It's a tough road to hoe.
I'm trying to figure out if I want to ask you this now or not. Let's go with it. Were there things that helped you to navigate that and to maintain your own sanity as best as possible? Obviously, a lot of our coping skills, again, as kids are fairly maladaptive because there's no power, there's no autonomy, really. It's really difficult, especially in this environment. But was there anything that helped get you through?
Yeah, I think in order to talk about that, I probably need to lead in a little bit. Because when I was middle school age, I was actually outed as not wanting to be a JW to my parents. When I was about 13, I had confided in a family friend. Basically, my dad's best friend's grandson was about my age, But he was not a Jehovah's Witness. His dad was disfellowshipped, but he had never been exposed to the church in any meaningful way. And so I was allowed a little bit of time with him in a group setting, to try to bring him into the fold. And I confided in him, thinking that he would be a safe person to talk to about the situation that I was in. And he didn't understand the gravity of the situation, how much was at stake for me to keep that confidence. And so he told his grandparents. It got back to my folks that same day. And inside of a week, I'd been pulled out of public school and put into homeschool. That was the beginning of an especially dire era of my mental health, because I had no resources. I had no contact outside the church, which was exactly as they had designed it. So my depression and my anxiety deepened and matured. I was in homeschool for about 3 years. And when I returned to public school was really kind of a rebirth for me. That was when there was about a year when I was really having to confront the social anxiety that I was experiencing around people who weren't JWs, much less, the ones who were, but kind of re-socializing into public school after that period of time. But once I did, what I found was that developing an authentic friend group was very, very meaningful. Some, folks who, while they couldn't understand my lived experience directly, had enough empathy for me as a person that they were able to be supportive. And that was very, very meaningful to me.
That's something you see a lot of times in families where maybe one parent is a witness and one parent is not. Anecdotally, it seems like there is a higher percentage of those kids that grow up and maybe don't remain Jehovah's Witnesses because they have had exposure to other people and
because they have the option.
Yeah, they have the option, and they can see I'm being lied to about who these people are to some degree. I'm not necessarily being told the whole truth, and also I am having different experiences over here that maybe I authentically feel more attached to. And
Right.
So that is something I always encourage, is that if you have a kid who's maybe the family is split and the child has to associate with the witnesses when with their mom or dad, if you're the other parent, if you can get your kids around some quality individuals who have some other ways of being, but who are just good folks, that's a really good thing to do, to help them to see that the world isn't this awful, terrible, horrible, scary place like they promote it to be at all times.
A really interesting aside, and mark this if you want to.
Sure.
But a really interesting aside is I've been doing some reading, an author that I really enjoy, Robert Anton Wilson, and he talks a lot about the kind of the tapes that we're imprinted with at a very early age. And so when you think about all of the imprinting that's done on Jehovah's Witness youth around what life is like for people who live in the world, if you're going to be a worldly person, then you are definitely going to be a prostitute. You're going to be doing hard drugs. You're going to be listening to heavy metal. You're going to be worshiping Satan. All of these things. Is it any wonder that kids who leave the church oftentimes feel like that's just what they have to be if they want to have some measure of freedom from religious oppression?
Yeah, I've often talked even on the podcast about how a lot of young people leave and they're given an idea of who people are on the outside, and it's often the young ex-JW who goes out and goes harder than anybody else, getting into everything that they can because they think they have to do that in order to fit in, because that's what they've been told people on the outside are, and that's just not the case. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that then results and those kids flaming out sometimes and then coming back to Jehovah's Witnesses, and then ending up on circuit assembly or district convention part or regional conventions, saying, oh, young people, I've been out there in the world. There's nothing out there for you. Right. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that serves them.
Absolutely. And another thing to comment on was that at least up until age 25, when I got my first really big chunk of therapy, I had experienced so much trauma inside that I was anesthetizing really heavily because I didn't have the tools to be able to deal with the complex feelings that I had. And I didn't, have a social structure that would be able to confront some of those issues alongside me. And so, there is that element where they're like, oh, and not specifically for me, but a metaphor for it would be if they were saying, oh, you're using opioids. Well, yeah, you beat the crap out of me. You broke my bones. Of course I'm using opioids because I'm in pain that you caused.
Absolutely. And so some of that going hard after leaving too, in certain ways, can also be that anesthetizing, that escape from what has happened without the proper tools to, or maybe it's just it's not your time yet to be able to avail yourself or seek those tools in order to find a life that doesn't necessarily involve that.
Exactly.
So, one of the things that I always talk to people about is their life at school. It sounds like yours was divvied up in different ways, because school for many is that escape to some degree, or it's a way to find other people that you can be around, or maybe be your real self with, or at least try on different personalities to see who your real self might be because you're confused and feel alone. What was school like for you? Was it a place where you found solace, at least until it was taken away for a time?
It was really complex. I think for some reason, because of the way that JWs undervalue education. So I didn't integrate well. I'm also neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at an early age. So kind of the combination of neurodivergence and then the social issues that were related to being raised JW and to only having that way to relate to people. I would say certainly the kind of first stage of my schooling was really complicated for me. It wasn't really a positive experience because, the kids could smell the weird on me, the non-JW kids. And of course, the JW kids weren't safe either.
Yeah.
And
that's like chum in the water.
Yeah, exactly right. And so, school was an isolating experience for me also during that first round. By the time I went back, though, I was 15. People knew by that point. I had been outed. So, of course, the rumor mill had churned up and there was all of that. And I had been doing what I could to distance myself from the org as early on as I possibly could. Not much success until I was about 15 or 16. When I returned to school, there was a period of time where I was experiencing so much social anxiety that I couldn't take lunch with the rest of the kids, right? So I would find a favorite teacher and say, hey, can I eat my lunch in your room? I wouldn't, talk to other kids, things like that. About halfway through the year, though, I, joined up with the group of kids who were the goth punk rocker. Yeah, I think in other schools they would have been the stoners, but pretty much I live in an area that's known for recreational marijuana. So my high school was kind of a stoner school. They weren't the stoner group, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But they were I say this with all affection, the social maladroits. And so I did find a home with them. And then about halfway through the following year, I kind of did a more full-throated socialization and began engaging with the greater group as well.
Okay.
So that was more positive. Of course, I didn't go to prom, anything like that. And it was during that year, what would have been my senior year in high school, that I started to be a little bit more of a human being. I touched on something right there that I would like to comment on also. One of the harms that was done to me by the church was that de-emphasis on education, on academics. When I was pulled from public school, the emphasis was on my spiritual health, not my academic health. And so, I certainly take some ownership of this, but recognize that I was a child. And so I can't take full ownership of it. But I went into what should have been my junior year with a credit and a half. So the equivalent of a freshman who had completed one semester.
Coming from a homeschooled environment where it's, oh my gosh. And I mean, as a person with ADHD, a kid with ADHD being told here, homeschool, and I don't know what kind of structure was it. Yeah, you're given a packet. Yeah, no way. You're not going to do that.
Exactly right. That was my experience.
No.
So I did spend that entire period reading and learning. Hindsight being 2020, maybe they shouldn't have allowed me access to the public library, because there were days that I spent all day at the public library. That was absolutely a refuge for me. So I spent the entire time reading and learning, but not completing any curriculum. So when I returned to public school, I was doing AP level literature and art, but I hadn't taken geometry.
Understood. Yes. Again, as an ADHD kid, put in a library, I'm going to go study what's interesting to me. Exactly. I'm not going to care at all about this packet, probably of things to do. Totally understood. And again, it's the de-emphasis on education. Were your parents checking on you to make sure you were doing all of your work? Were they? I mean, they chose to take you out of school, so were they on top of it?
I wouldn't say that they were on top of it. Both of my parents were working full time at that point. My mom was working from home. My dad had a repair and remodel construction business, so he was in and out of the home. And of course, I had regular check-ins with the academic staff in our region, the ones who were the administrators of the homeschool program.
Okay.
And I think that they would sweat my parents once in a while, kind of be like, hey, he's really not doing anything. And they would come back to me and talk to me about it, but it was very clearly not a priority. I certainly during those years spent a lot more time studying the JW literature than the academics. And because, the apocalypse could come at any time, the important thing was a person's faith journey. It was not something that they cared about too much.
Understood. So you're talking about that faith journey aspect. What was the faith journey that they had you on, as far as your all's involvement with the congregation itself? So obviously at 6 years old, you had your own, epiphanies or awakening in some way. You knew this wasn't necessarily for you, but yet, again, back to kind of that prison aspect, you have to study everything. You have to go to the meetings. You have to be involved in something that's inauthentic for you.
Right.
Was it just a struggle all the time, or did you find was there anything there for you? I mean, it sounds like you all would have been at every meeting, sure out in service regularly, things like that. So was there anything there for you? Do you have any friends, or did you enjoy any aspect of it at all?
Right.
Was it just torture?
So I did have a couple of friends, one who is now out, but his folks were kind of more liberal JWs, which was to me a very foreign concept. The way that I had been taught to perceive them was as bad JWs, because the parents would have a cocktail in the hot tub. The kid who was my age at 16 was allowed to watch R-rated movies once in a while. They had a video game system, things along those lines. We knew that before they had been JWs, they had done drugs, like kind of this whole like tainted JW thing. So I was allowed to be friends with these two people because their parents were in, they brought all the kids in, and they were, following the letter of the law to a reasonable extent. With that being said, those folks were also in their own complex journeys to understanding. I think that they were a little bit more 1 foot in, 1 foot out, where they're like, oh yeah, I believe in Jehovah and I believe in like these tenets, but I'm going to smoke a cigarette. I'm going to, maybe have a secret worldly girlfriend, things like that. So I did have that aspect in my life. In terms of like the JW doctrine or their biblical teachings, there really was nothing that spoke to me when I was, sitting in a meeting. I think that the closest thing that I found to anything meaningful in the Bible while I was sitting at a meeting would probably be in going through and finding doctrinal conflicts. Great example is in Genesis, when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. God says, so that they don't become like we are, both living forever and knowing good from evil. And with that, he expelled them from the garden. I was like, who's we? If Jehovah is one God only, who's we who gets to live forever and also know right from wrong? Finding those types of conflicts with their doctrine and their version of the Bible even was entertaining and stimulating to me.
Oh wow, that's so that is intriguing that you, even at a young age, were looking at and for those things.
Internal inconsistencies. I was obsessed with them. Okay. And I still am.
Sure. How did you make it? Because being one of Jehovah's Witnesses is not a passive interest. It is a very active practice of going out in the ministry and giving talks and things. And if you're being groomed to be a CO or a DO, you're going to have to participate. So right. Being that it was something that you really weren't feeling, what was it like for you to, as a very young person, have to go out and tell people about something that maybe you didn't feel, or to get up and give a talk about something that, I mean, you don't get to pick the subject of your talk. So, right. Giving a talk about something that you may not have even really agreed with. How did you navigate that?
That's a great question. Definitely really beefy compartmentalization skills. That was a huge chunk of it. It didn't really do anything to off-put the shame of being in the field ministry. That was probably my least favorite. Ultimately, if you think about it, just the meetings, even with robust study beforehand, 5-10 hours a week, very doable, easy to mitigate, easy to hide. But there's nothing that quite compares to the shame of knocking on a door, seeing a peer, and being forced to deliver a spiel. That was very, very challenging for me. I gave my first talk when I was like 8. So that was something that I was used to. And the participation level I saw as a way to just avoid conflict, avoid any of this complexity. We had done a ton of preparation for every single meeting, and there was an expectation that I raise my hand for almost every question. And I had the answers, and I had not just the rote answers, but I had the ability to put it into my own words, the sentiment that they were looking for. And I just knew that that was part of the price that I had to pay for flying under the radar.
Wow. I've heard you have to comment at least once or prepare a comment for a specific question. Never heard an expectation to pretty much have your hand up for every question.
Right. Well, the way that we would prepare for the meetings was not just to read the material, but to read the material, have discussion on every paragraph, have every family member give their own answer for every question. And so, the preparation was such that, they wanted me to be visible, I think is a great way to say it.
Yes, and visible for the quote right reasons, right?
Exactly. Exactly right.
It makes them look good too. There's a reason for that. It goes beyond. It makes everybody is. Your dad's an elder. He needs his son to portray a certain thing, and I just wonder. Seems reasonable to think that perhaps since your sister had been disfellowshipped, that may have put a lot more pressure on you, because we've got to make this one has to be the one that carries the mantle. Yes,
he was very nearly encouraged to step down from his role as elder when my sister left. And ultimately, when I left and my mom actually separated and eventually divorced him right around that same time period, that was when it was no longer optional for him to step down as an elder.
Understood.
Because, of course, public perception is everything for them.
So usually just having your own kid run off the rails, according to them, at 16, that's going to be enough. You're not going to be asked to step down. That's usually enough to get deleted for not presiding over your own household in a fine manner.
Right.
Interesting that didn't happen there. And of course, it's all whatever they agree to, somewhat subjective in ways. So how did life go for you? So first want to make sure we're not missing anything that needed to be spoken about in your early life, but as you're going into your teenage years, somewhere in here you're baptized, right?
Yeah. So it was when I was about 13. It was during the homeschool era. So things were pretty severe for me right after getting pulled into homeschool, and I thought that getting baptized would be a good way to let the pressure off. Plus, my peer group was doing it. 13's kind of the age, or at least it was in our congregation. So I got baptized. It was kind of a non-event for me, and it really didn't materially change my situation at all. I still had the same amount of pressure. I still had the same requirements. I had hoped that it would kind of get me out from under the microscope. Like, oh, he's baptized, he's good. We don't need to worry about what he's reading or thinking in the same way. That was certainly not the case. And so things continued, and they got very, very dark for me for several years. I was suicidal, looking for other ways to escape and also find justice, where there did not seem to be any. And I endured. It was right around this age that I went behind my parents' back and contacted an aunt who had been disfellowshipped. She left the church back in the 70s with the failed apocalypse. The whole 72 thing. So that was when 72, 75. She left then, and I knew that she was in contact with my sister. I had talked to my sister on a monitored phone line I think twice during this period, 7-year period. So I reached out to my aunt, who put me in contact with my sister while I was visiting in another state. And my sister drove up and saw me. So I got to meet my sister again for the first time, which was really, really profoundly meaningful to me.
I can only
She
imagine.
seemed to be happy and healthy and lovely. She had a husband who, as far as I knew, was a great person, seemed like a great person. She seemed very successful. So that in and of itself was encouraging. But she also told me that if things, I don't think that I told her that I had been struggling with suicidal ideation at that point in time. But she no doubt understood kind of what the landscape was likely for me. So she told me that if it ever became unbearable, that I could reach out to her as a support, and she could help me with a place to live and working through emancipation, if that was the move, and so on and so forth. So things continued to, after that summer, things continued to build up in pressure and intensity for me. It did become unbearable. I called her actually from the Kingdom Hall. One of my dad's favorite things to do was to volunteer our family to clean the hall and then drop me off and pick me up 2 hours later.
Okay.
Yes.
By yourself?
So that was exciting. Yes, correct.
Okay. Here, Arthur, go clean the Kingdom Hall.
That was exactly what it was. But they had an open phone line there. And so I called her and I told her, I can't do this anymore. And she said that if that's the case, she'll get me a ticket tomorrow. But that in her own process, she had grown to regret the damage that leaving in the way that she did, the damage that it had done to her relationship with my parents. Because she didn't talk to them about it before, during, or after. She didn't unpack it with them. She didn't explain, hey, I'm okay. I'm just not going to do this thing. She just up and left and then ghosted them. So she said, if you do one thing for me, please just tell them that you are leaving and tell them the reason why. Because I regretted that. You don't have to. But I wish that I had told them that I was leaving and the reason why. So I agreed. And knowing that I had a very tangible escape plan, it wasn't just this abstract thing where, I'm going to pack a backpack and hitchhike to Canada and live free. Knowing that I had an actual real escape, it gave me the encouragement that I needed to be able to last until I turned 18.
Wow. So you mentioned something when you were talking that I wanted to ask you about. You said that you were having these dark times, you were having these ideations and such, and that you were looking for something and something and something. But what struck me is you said justice.
Right.
And I was wondering for you, what was the justice you were looking for? Why justice? What did that mean to you?
So something that we haven't really unpacked in this conversation yet, that I would like to maybe do in order to frame it appropriately, is to talk about the abuse that's not just inherent within the org, but that was also active in my family of origin.
Sure.
Because I grew up in an environment that was abusive on many different spectra. I think that at the time, it might not have been considered physical abuse with the understanding that we have in today's day and age. The nature of the corporal punishment that I experienced would not be acceptable. I would have been in a, Division of Family and Youth Services situation, likely based on the corporal punishment. The extreme isolation, verbal abuse, body shaming, gendered shaming, kind of all of this that I experienced at the hands of, in particular, my father. He was very clearly an abuser, and I was one of the recipients of that abuse. And so knowing that there would never be any fairness or justice accorded to him. And the desperation that I felt to escape is what inspired, my suicidal ideation. But understanding that my experience was as a direct result of his management of the family, I also wanted to remove him from the plane of existence in the same fell swoop that I removed myself. And so I had a well-developed plan to kind of mete out justice and also release myself from my own hellish experience. And that's not hyperbole. Like it was a hellish experience for many years.
Yeah. Well, it's sad that any kid should ever have to get to a point where they feel that desperate, the desperation to get out, however they have to get out and get away. I think I mentioned on my initial podcast, This JW Life, that when I was a kid, I mean, there was a moment where I got up in the middle of the night because I was tired of my own mental and emotional abuse from my father. And I went to the kitchen and I got a knife, and it wasn't going to be used on me while he slept. But I could not bring myself to do that. And I
knew where the firearms were. I knew where the ammo was.
There you go.
And I had access to them. And there were many nights where I wondered if that was going to be the night.
I understand. It's so sad that, again, like I said, that any of us as children, we were children. And
this was like 13, 14. So it's not even like I was, mostly an adult. It was very much a child still.
Yeah. I used to write letters and tape them up next to the wall by my bed where my dad would see them when he would come and wake me up for school the next day. I don't know whatever happened to those letters. But certainly nothing was ever changed, and no one ever talked to me about it. There was no acknowledgement whatsoever about feelings and things. And it's just it's brutal. It's absolutely brutal to feel that alone in your own house.
Yeah. And I remember actually, and this is a fairly buried memory, but discussing it, I remember having a conversation with my dad shortly after they pulled me out of public school about his abusive behavior towards me. And, that was the moment, I didn't have the term for it yet, but that was the moment when I realized that any sincere conversation that was not on track for him would be immediately gaslit. So I'd say, hey, you're a big jerk to me. You say these hurtful things. No, I don't. I was just making a joke. I said, no, this stuff really hurts my feelings. I can't and I won't tolerate this from you. Kind of being drawn into that conflict situation where I had to tell them, no, I don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness anymore. Opened the door to me stepping away from some of my conflict averse behaviors, right? Because I was terrified of conflict in that situation. And so it really afforded me an opportunity to confront him regarding, the abusive behavior. Deny. And then afterwards being like, hey, remember when I talked to you about you being a jerk to me? This is that. Oh, well, no, that's not, kind of that whole scenario.
Yeah. Still some sort of obfuscation that leads to you somehow being the one who deserved whatever happened, or he didn't do it, or
yes,
I was
not only did I not do it, I didn't do it as a joke.
Yes. Oh yes, I was just joking, or you're too sensitive.
Yeah, exactly.
As a way of dismissing your feelings through the gaslighting.
But true to form, the most sensitive person in the house was him.
Oh, of course. Yes.
So if anyone tried to make any sort of a joke or offhand comment or anything like that, it turned into a huge issue, but no one else's feelings were authentic.
Of course. Same here. My dad, the elder, always the victim of everybody ganging up on him. Poor guy. You know,
Yeah.
he was the one that everybody was ganging up on.
But if you think about it, that makes perfect sense because that's kind of baked into the JW DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone disagrees with us, and that's how we know that we're right.
Oh yeah, the JWs were gaslighting us just as much as our fathers were, you know, in just our cases, right? You know, gaslighting is super. It's one of the things I go over in my coaching practice with people because it's so prevalent in the organization. They are masters of gaslighting you so that you doubt yourself and have to look to them.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
He with the authority creates the reality.
Yep. Truer words.
Yes. So were you ever in any meetings so my mom would go to the elders and talk to them about my father and who he was. Did that ever happen for you guys? And did you ever get pulled into any meetings to corroborate anything there? Was it ever
No.
taken into account in the congregation at all?
No, because of his position and the way that he had maneuvered politically. There were a couple of times where I had gone to elders to try to get some sort of a support, to talk to them about what was going on. I believe I used the term abuse when I went to them. That would have been kind of around the same era, but a little bit later on, probably about 14. And what came of it was that they immediately went to my dad, who addressed the matter at home.
I guess. Yes, just let the elder address it with their family. I don't know, that wasn't said to me, but I would imagine that might have been what was going on in my family as well. You know, it's just a family matter. Let my dad address it with the rest of the family.
Yeah, I would say that the closest thing, though, and this is all a little bit hazy. I haven't thought about this stuff for years, but you may recall that my mom was leaving my dad at around the same time that I was formally leaving the church. So I remember having at least one meeting with the elders where we talked about my mom's situation as well. And I think that would be the closest, but as I recall, it was pretty transparent that they were looking for talking points to invalidate her experience,
of course,
not to really find the heart of the matter and to support the people who needed the support.
Yeah, that absolutely rings true. So so you've gone through all of this. So the justice that you were seeking was surrounding your father, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've gone through all of this. You've been really low. Now you do have a way out if you should need one. You have spoken. So you went and told your parents how you felt?
Well, so the way that you're talking about my eventual exit from?
In response to your sister saying, hey, if you're gonna do this, at least tell mom and dad why. Did you have a conversation with your mom and dad, or did just knowing that your sister was there and that was there, did that suffice?
Yes, it was the latter. So okay. Understanding that I wasn't trapped, let a lot of the pressure off.
Okay.
And I no longer felt desperate because I knew that I had an option. The idea of going to my parents and saying, hey, I'm going to leave because this is terrible, that wasn't incredibly attractive to me. It was more attractive than being stuck there. And so, but I was the person who got to make the decision. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Oh, sure.
So that fortified me to endure. It was only about another 1.5 or 2 years, which is, of course, forever in child time. But I, in short order, returned to public school when I was 15. And then that was kind of the beginning of a different transformational experience, because I was able to engage productively with my peer group. And I was able to start forming some authentic friendships, some of which I still have to this day. And that was the relief that I had been needing. There were still a lot of oppressive things that were happening. And I was terrified initially for my folks to understand that I was having friends kind of outside the church. So that was tough, but I was also at the point and at the age, and felt supported enough by my peers that if they did do something wild, that I knew that I would not be alone and that I would be able to survive. Rational or not, for many years, I held in the back of my head that if I left the church in a meaningful way, that they may possibly kill me to save my soul type of situation. I know that that's not a common practice with JWs, but having been raised in a house where violence was part of the vocabulary, and having heard explicitly that my spiritual health was their number one priority and they would make any sacrifice to ensure it, I had concerns about safety up until that point. But I would say that it was probably right around 15, 16, 17 where I realized that that was probably not while the fear was emotionally realistic,
Sure.
It was probably not going to actually physically happen.
Still, though, that's that's quite a fear to have hanging over your head. Jehovah's Witnesses have a way of not to diminish what you're talking about there, because you're talking about it in a very real way.
Right.
But at the end of the day, their shunning policies, they have a way of killing all of us. They have a way of destroying that relationship, severing that tie, and making sure that we know that we are dead to them.
Right.
And so there is kind of a way that they do that, even if it's not
a physical path.
The physical way that they do it.
And I think that too, that was right around the age when I was independent enough and I had enough of a self-image, like I had forged through the jungle to kind of create myself, the version of myself that was approaching authenticity, that I really didn't care what they did anymore. And so when, for example, I introduced them to one of my school friends for the first time, and afterwards they were shitty about it. I'm sorry, is this a swearing? Is that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I thought so, but
it's a podcast.
So I made a real friend, and they saw them, and they were shitty about it, and they got an eye roll and derision from me, as opposed to the fear response that they crave and that they appreciate. Mm-hmm. It really diffused, I think, a lot of their ammunition for continuing to use the church to harm me in that way.
Interesting. I mean, it kind of is, how do you deal with a bully? You punch him in the nose. And then you find out that there's really not as much behind there as you thought. And not that that's always the case, obviously.
Right.
But I'm just saying, sometimes, so they were starting to see that you were willing to and going to walk your own path in some ways, at least.
Right.
That they disapproved of.
I think that that's really apropos that you compare it to punching a bully in the nose, because they're really, really good at building up the fear and the anxiety around the exit. But those of us who have left, and I hope that anyone listening to this podcast who is, physically and mentally out, really hears this, they it is much scarier the way it is built up in our heads than it is in reality. That's not to take away from anyone's experience, any of the trauma of separating, of being shunned, that kind of ongoing and persisting trauma, being re-traumatized when you see an old friend or a family member at the grocery store. That's still painful. But for me, the real pain was leading up to leaving. That was where it was the most painful, is the fear that was associated with leaving, not the
the fear is often worse than the actual thing, right? I mean, anxiety.
Almost always.
Not always, but almost always, right?
Yeah.
And it truly is that. We just kind of mentioned an institutionalized view of things earlier. We're kind of institutionalized and loyal, sometimes even to a fault, to the organization, almost like a form of Stockholm syndrome to some degree.
100%.
And sometimes that same thing can be present within our families, where we can even feel that way toward the people that raised us or that we were around. And again, like you said, often the fear of what you're losing is worse than what you actually are.
Yep, 100%. And that was my experience. I was terrified for so many years. And when it actually happened, when I actually started, confronting the church head on for the practices that I consider to be unloving, unchristian. Also, I consider them to be unchristian.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't as bad. They didn't have anything behind it. So I remember, my dad trying to sucker me into the circular logic that they use to convince people that they're right. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, they forced me to not see any validity in the Bible, because that was the only way that I could get him to stop talking to me about it.
Oh, wow.
So, well, the Bible says such and such. And eventually I was like, I don't believe in the Bible. And he just deflated. And at that point, he knew that he didn't have any way to get purchase on me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because if you don't share that in that moment, then what is there to talk about? Because that's what they say, that everything they believe is based on.
Right. Correct.
That's their claim. So how did things progress then? So, you're going to high school, you're getting near the end of it in your senior year. How does your life continue to progress?
Sure. So that was the time when I engaged in my first romantic relationship.
Mm.
And that was revolutionary for me in a couple of different ways. Certainly because I had never experienced affection or love in that way. And so it was profound for me as an individual. It was very pleasant, very pleasurable. Hindsight being 2020, I recognize that was also my first opportunity to engage in a codependent relationship of my own making. So there was certainly that element of it as well. But I would say that one of the things that was probably the most pleasant, and they may never hear this, but if they do, shout out, you know who you are, was that I got access to a family in a way that I had not before. So, my partner at the time had two loving parents who were reasonably successful. They had a nice lifestyle. They were loving. They were supportive of their child. She was on a track to go to college. They encouraged me to go to college, which was the first time that had happened in my life. And they were generally supportive and reasonably healthy. And I had never experienced anything like that. So that was very foundational to me. And through the years, that that did grow into my opportunity to confront some of my maladaptive behaviors. I was so unhappy. I was finally finding happiness. It just lived inside another person.
Wow. Yes. Yes. I mean, you mentioned the not that that's entirely codependent, but the codependent relationship earlier. And yeah, so Jehovah's Witnesses are narcissists leading codependents. And
Yeah.
we come from that. And so it's very likely that we will fall into or have some relationships that represent that dysfunction in some way, and that we have to work our way through. And that's okay. We're learning as we go, as long as, and growing, and nobody's trying to hurt anybody.
Right. Yeah. And I don't blame myself. Looking back there, it's a little cringy.
Yeah, we were all set up. We were all set up for that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, 100%. So with their encouragement, I got my GED and I went directly to college, which was looking back, I see it as a tremendous growth experience, but it was also very, very challenging. And that's where I first began anesthetizing in earnest. My partner at the time was going to school on the East Coast. I live in Alaska, so long distance relationship, and especially a long distance relationship between two glorified high schoolers.
Sure.
There was a lot of complexity there, but also just kind of being plucked out of this extremely sheltered situation. Even though I had begun the process of forging new social relationships, I didn't have any idea how to live, how to relate to people. And the educational experience that I received was pretty disappointing in a lot of ways. Not just because of my own maladaptive behavior, but I certainly acknowledge my role in it. But I had always kind of dreamt of this academic utopian environment. I'm very passionate about learning. I love it. To this day, I'm constantly learning, constantly growing. And to get into that environment and to see people not taking it seriously, not paying attention in class clowns, all of that happening, I found it really offensive, I think. And I recognized also that to have any real meaning for me, and I'm not projecting this onto anyone else, everyone has their own path, but for the academic learning to have any real meaning for me at that stage in my life, I needed to have more real life experience. So my intention was to take a year, maybe a couple of years off from school, and then return after having traveled a little bit in the lower 48. For anyone who has never lived in Alaska, it's kind of like one big small town. It's expansive, it's beautiful, but it is 2.5 times the size of Texas. And even today, less than 750,000 people live in the whole state.
Oh my gosh, I did not. Wow, you put that in perspective.
Yes.
Wow.
So I had traveled around Alaska a little bit, but hadn't spent any meaningful chunks of time in the lower 48. I had, visited, vacationed with folks. I think the longest stretch that I'd spent was the month when I visited my sister. I was staying with my grandpa in northern Washington. So I planned to come down to the lower 48 and to have a bohemian adventure, which I did. I traveled down here for about a year, where I think that on the outset, and this was something that was accessible to folks here in Alaska, but I really wanted that kind of beat experience of kind of living on the edges, urban camping. I had discovered psychedelics at that point, which was very foundational to my experience. And, I wanted to live that kind of, I might have even at the time called it a hippie lifestyle, although I cringe at the term now because of the complexity associated with it. So I did upstate New York, Vermont, Arizona, New Orleans and Florida in the space of about a year. And during that time was the first time that I experienced homelessness, like actual homelessness, living as a squatter, living with people who were injecting hard drugs on a regular basis. I was very good even then about not exercising value judgment against them. But I certainly got the real world, real life experience that I was looking for.
So at this time, when you're going out and experiencing life, were you still associated with the witnesses at that time?
No. I'm sorry. Yeah, let me go back.
Okay, or I don't know. So that was post JW life, but there was a specific way that all went down, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there was. Yeah, sorry for jumping ahead a little bit.
Oh, no, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
I got the girlfriend in high school and we were seeing each other. And that was kind of the leverage that I needed to accelerate what I thought was going to be the disfellowshipping program for me. I had always kind of knew that was on the menu, that was going to be something that I would order at some point in time. My folks were terrified that I would do it before I turned 18. So I made a commitment to them that I would stay. They were still absolutely phobic of me leaving before I was 18. So for their benefit, not so much for mine, we actually made a deal for some material goods that if I stayed in the church until I turned 18, that they would give me a van that had been in the family that I really loved. It was a 78 Chevy camper van, which was
sweet.
Great for a young bohemian living in a rural area.
I had a 79 Chevy van. So yeah, that's awesome.
So many fond memories, so many. To this day, I still, very idyllic element of my life during those ages.
Yeah, I can see that. So there was a monetary exchange essentially for you to remain a witness. And why was it until 18? What was it about that? Was your dad worried about losing his position? Were they just not wanting to kick out a job?
I don't know. I honestly think it was the trauma of my sister leaving and the way that they left. But apart from that, it never made logical sense to me because they were absolutely phobic about it, like terrified of the idea that I might leave home, leave the church, like before I turned 18. But to me, it seemed so arbitrary. And at that point, I was very out as a person, not out of the organization, but I was very much my own person to them. And so the stakes for me had been drastically lowered because I had friends. I wouldn't spend the night out, but I could stay out somewhat late. I was essentially, in many ways, living my best life. I had flat out been refusing to go to meetings. They didn't want me in field service anymore. Kind of that space was what was happening for me. So I never understood their insistence that I stay in until I was 18. I told them, hey, sure, no problem. I'm doing okay now. But they didn't believe it. And they would constantly grill me about my plans to, my plans to leave the house, leave the church, all of this. And so when they offered that, I hastily agreed. I loved that van. I was very happy to get it. But I was also very clear that that wasn't why I had agreed to it. You may recall from earlier in the conversation that my sister really emphasized to me that by being careful with the way that I left, even if I didn't want a relationship with them in that moment, I would preserve the possibility for future Arthur.
Okay.
And that made sense to me.
Sure. Allow me to break in here for a second. This channel is made possible by you, the listener. If you appreciate what we're doing here, please consider supporting at patreon.com/shunned, or leave a review on iTunes or other platforms. Like and subscribe. All those things help the channel. If you're looking for merch, you can go get some Shun swag from the shunpodcast.com website or reach out there to be on the show. If you're looking for more ex-Jehovah's Witness content, I'll recommend my first podcast called This JW Life. You can find that on podcast apps as well as YouTube. And if you're feeling stuck in life, struggling to find happiness and community, maybe you're haunted by the past, beating yourself up, unsure of who you are or what you even want out of life now that you've lost this one identity that was given to you by a cult, reach out through my other sites like exjwhelp.com, that's exjwhelp.com, or storyworkscoaching.com. And let's see about working together to help you find a life that fits you and who you are, maybe for the first time ever. And now, back to our guest. So now, you mentioned the way you said it, that you were going to order up the disfellowshipping. I found that kind of an interesting use of words. So can I ask, so before we get into what actually happened there, what made you go down that path? In other words, is there any reason that could you have faded? Or would that not likely be a possibility because your dad would probably turn you in and have that ordered up anyway, or whatever the case may be? Or did you just want to take a stand as you left?
So there was an element of wanting to take a stand as I left, but even more so, kind of talking back to the demographics of the state and how visible I was in the JW community. So because of some of the things I talked about previously, Alaska doesn't have a huge population, but has a pretty good sized JW population, as well as, kind of my dad's position and the way that they had been grooming me for a position of authority. I couldn't go to a grocery store without running into a JW. I had been informed on funny story. When I was like about 13, found a really cool vintage suitcase in amazing condition, like satin lined, just brass fittings, gorgeous. Got it for like $2 or $3. I loved this little suitcase. Picked it up at the thrift store. I was going to get picked up by my folks a little bit later. So I just carried it with me to the grocery store, and I sat down and was reading comics in the aisle. And I had been sitting there and reading for 20 minutes when one of my parents showed up to scoop me and asked me if I had plans to go anywhere.
Oh my
gosh. I had a very tangible understanding of there being a network of informants. Fading was not an option for me, or it did not feel like one at the time.
Wow, no, I understand that. My goodness, you bought a suitcase and word got out. That is wild.
20 minutes. And I was shocked, and I was confronted about it. Like, very directly. Where are you going? What are you doing? Why do you need this suitcase?
So you went to the elders, and you knew you had to be unrepentant with something, right? And so what did you go in there and tell them?
Well, I committed the great sins of smoking cigarettes, smoking cannabis, and having a physical relationship with my beautiful partner at the time.
Gotcha.
And I was not sorry about any of them. I didn't pretend to be, not just because I was looking to exit, but also I was genuinely very happy with the direction my life was starting to go. And that was kind of the beginning of the judicial process with them. But as time went on, they really prosecuted how long I had been feeling this way, how long I had not believed in the Jehovah's Witness organization. And ultimately, they began questioning me about the circumstances surrounding my baptism.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes.
And so why were they asking you about your baptism?
Because as we were kind of discussing my history, of course, they had visibility to me having been outed when I was 13. They knew about that. So they could assume that it was happening since before then. And they asked me how long it had actually been happening. I let them know since my sister. They were like, well, you were baptism, you made a commitment to Jehovah. I said, well, I did the thing that I felt like I was supposed to do, and to try to get a little pressure off myself, get a little heat off myself in this, extremely damaging environment. And I didn't realize it at the time. I was most interested in just getting myself out of that situation. Judicial committee meetings under the best circumstances are deeply pleasant for pretty much everyone involved, I think. I think there might be some elders who get like a sick glee out of it.
It's pretty unpleasant.
Yeah. And so I was just like, what do I need to say and do to get out of here? But I was honest about the fact that I hadn't believed that the Jehovah's Witnesses were divinely inspired, or if so, that their God was not a good God, since I was very young. And that as part of it, they really started to prosecute my baptism a lot. Why did you say this? Was there ever a time when you believed? That type of questioning.
And what was your answer to that? No, I never believed, or?
That I believed up until the point when my sister left. And that after that, it had all just been because I was made miserable at home.
Interesting. So then in this meeting, were you also telling them again about your dad to some degree, or just the pressure parentally, whether it was one or both? I think
to a certain extent, although something that I haven't really super gotten into in our conversation is that this is the same time in my life when my mom was leaving my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And she was trying to stay in the church during that point in time. But a lot of the experiences, the internal workings of the family, were being exposed through that process. So there were certainly a couple of times where I was corroborating things that my mom was saying about him. But I had a very, very tangible understanding that the purpose of the judicial meeting was to protect the congregation and the Jehovah's Witness institution. So it was not a matter of like, oh, hey, was there wrongdoing? Like, were you harmed? What was your home environment like? Was that positive? I definitely got the sense that I was talking to Jehovah's Witness HR to help to ensure they weren't going to be sued. Maybe not literally sued, but I think you take my meaning.
Yeah, I mean, the JWHR, that's absolutely what it probably wasn't a lot of respect for you. So they're going all the way back to your baptism with what purpose?
Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that it was to protect my dad and to try to protect his position in the church. And the reason why I say that is that I was seeking to be disfellowshipped, because as someone who had been baptized, I saw that as my only real out. And I was very surprised to hear that the announcement that was made regarding my status with the church wasn't disfellowshipping, but that they did in fact invalidate my baptism. And I suspect that that was to kind of protect their public face, the public face of the organization a little bit, internally. But I also suspect more than anything else that it was my dad's buddies trying to soften the appearance of him badly mismanaging his family.
Understood. So it wasn't necessarily his mismanagement of the family. It was that you never believed. And there's just something with you that was the issue all along. Should have never been baptized in the first place. And therefore, your dad did not have two kids disfellowshipped. He had one disfellowshipped and one that should have never been baptized in the first place.
Exactly
Wow.
right.
That's interesting. So I've never actually heard this announcement. Were you there when they announced that your baptism was invalidated, or were you told? I've never heard this announcement before.
So I was not there. I had not yet been to the point where I would like never go to a meeting with them, but I was really, really, really close. Like, I think that I would go to the memorial, and then, if I didn't have anything going on and they made a big deal about it, then maybe I would. But by the time that I was in judicial committee meetings, I had zero interest in attending because I was 100% out at that point. And I just had no interest in it. Yeah, it was reported back to me both by the judicial committee that was the direction that they were going to take, and then by my family as well, as I recall.
Wow. And how did you feel? So you go into this judicial committee, you feel like you're going to get disfellowshipped, and they instead do an annulment or an invalidation essentially of your baptism,
right?
And tell you that they're going to do that. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like, well, okay, cool, so then we're going to do this and then I get to keep my family or not be shunned? Or, I mean, did you see it as a potentially positive thing?
So at the time, made no difference to me.
Okay.
At the time, all I wanted was to sever the ties, and they could have called it a purple monkey bandana. And as long as I didn't have to still be in that same situation, I was fine with it. I felt like I was being honest, felt like I was being authentic and living authentically. So I wasn't really caught up on whatever terminology or legal maneuvering they were making. And functionally, it made no real difference. So I was still shunned. I still, got the dirty looks at the grocery store. I had, elders that were my dad's friends would come and try to counsel me, which was a uniquely gross experience. I think that, as I'm talking about this, I think back to when I was outed and the conversation that I had with my folks then, when they told me that if I was disfellowshipped at that age, that I would still have to go to meetings 3 times a week. I'd still have to sit in on family study, and I'd still have to go in field ministry with them. And that was the most terrifying thing, was being disfellowshipped and having to go in field ministry, because they said that they would make me sit in the car.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Because I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, how do you go out in service as a disfellowship person? They can't let you talk to people at the doors. Oh, they would just make you ride along and rot in the car.
Yes.
Wow.
Like trapped with 4 people who think that I'm the literal devil. And that was the scariest of the threats that they made against me during that initial, outing. So at the end of it, I was honestly really disgusted with the organization. I was really disgusted with the people who adhered to it. I couldn't have cared less if they shunned me or not. I had kind of done all of the work that I was able to beforehand to prepare myself for the fact that, I wasn't going to have any friends. I wasn't going to have any family members. I mean, I was starting to form these new friendships, but the guy who was the first guy to hold me after I was born, other than my parents, that they were going to see me as scum, all of this. So I had at least somewhat mentally prepared for that. And that was what I was set up for. And that was the experience that I got. And it wasn't until years later that I really understood the legal distinction that they had made between disfellowshipping and invalidating my baptism.
And in the end, I find that interesting. You see that. So I'm thinking about your invalidation. So because you were invalidated instead of disfellowship, there were still people who thought that they could access you, and well, there were still people trying to access you and counsel you, right?
Well,
Like you mentioned, but I
I
guess
think,
you would have that with disfellowshipping too.
yeah, the elders would still reach out to and try to counsel a
Yeah,
disfellowship person who is like amenable to it.
yeah.
So I don't think that that really made any functional difference. And something that I'd like to speak to, and I'm sure that you're familiar with this, as is anyone who's lived in the organization, you don't have to be disfellowshipped or disassociated to be shunned.
Of
You don't
course
have to
not.
be publicly reproved to be shunned.
Oh,
You
I've
know,
had people on the podcast who faded and they're shunned.
yeah, or even who have not faded. Maybe they were seen standing next to someone who was smoking a cigarette and they didn't respond in the appropriate way. Maybe they saw the wrong PG-13 movie. Maybe they let their kids read Harry Potter. You know, there are a million different social judgments that can result in a de facto shunning, even if there's been no announcement. A word gets around.
Oh, for sure. I mean, again, shunning is in the DNA of the cult. That's
Yeah.
one of the reasons I named this podcast Shunned,
Yeah,
is because they try to deny that they shun. And we all know that not only do they do it, they look for opportunities to do it.
absolutely. And that was one of the things that was really interesting is that, and I want to stay focused on my story and not on other people's, but what I saw was that my mom was still a believer when she left my dad. She believed that she had grounds under, risk to her spiritual health to leave him. And so she was following all of the steps that the elders were saying, even like being separated, but living under the same roof, which was, a very uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. But because of the way that the church actually works, she was shunned while she was still going to the meetings and she was looked down on and people were judging her. And it was that treatment that ultimately pushed her away from the organization.
Well, I'm glad that she was able to see the treatment for what it is.
Yeah.
It's so damaging. I just, I know sometimes people see everybody's trying to avoid being shunned in some way, and a lot of people will try to, even in the X community, will try to have their baptisms invalidated, thinking that that's going to make a difference. And maybe with some person that it could, don't know. But at the end of the day, functionally, like you're saying, everybody knows what it is, right? On some level. And they know, just like if you're approved in the congregation, if publicly, people start shunning because they know that you're, quote, bad association and that's what they're going to have to do.
Right.
So it really doesn't necessarily have a functional difference in the way that it ends up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that I would really, if I had the opportunity, I would caution people against thinking along those lines, that they can somehow manage to avoid shunning. Because in my experience, and I think that folks will likely be able to relate to this in their own ways, if you're seen talking to someone who is seen as a bad association, then that stink sticks to you also.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just continues on, because they're always looking for a reason to reject someone, right?
Absolutely.
And so it
it's
doesn't
also,
even have to be your error or your friend's error. But if you are friends with someone whose friend made an error, then that can fall all the way down to you as well, very easily, very quickly.
Of course, we saw my disfellowshipped brother one time, and my wife's family shunned her instantly for doing so.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
still believed in many ways, but they just took that opportunity to go ahead and pull the shun
Yep.
gun out.
The shun gun. Yeah.
And it also, though, if you're trying to go through all these moves to get this done to keep people so that they won't shun you, it also, while it makes you feel on some level like you might have control, it also betrays a feeling that maybe you feel like you have some responsibility for that. And it's not your responsibility how these people react to you or treat you. It is entirely their own. You can, even if you disassociate and they're going to shun you, it's still not your responsibility. That's theirs. That's their action. That's their choice or their coercion or whatever. But that's up to them. That's not your choice.
That's exactly right. And I think that has been one of the things that I've personally struggled with quite a bit is, the issues of control around it. Like, I don't want this to be the reality. Is there anything that I can do to change it? And having to come to peace with the fact that I can't force people, even family members or people that I grew up with, to want to have a relationship with me, and that they'll find the excuses. They'll find the ways to back up the beliefs that they have chosen to hold.
Again, Jehovah's Witnesses look for reasons to shun. They're
exactly
constantly on guard and hyper vigilant that somehow you might be a threat to their perceived spirituality or a threat to eventually their salvation, which is what they're the most worried about. And they're going to save themselves over you any day.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
They say they give their life for you, but would they really? No.
No, because they won't give a casual conversation.
No, they won't give a hello.
Yeah. So, yeah, no, not at all.
So you end up going through this process. Your baptism is invalidated. And then, as you were talking about earlier, you had then, gone and were kind of seeing the world in some ways, exploring the US and such. Was that in any way a byproduct of what had happened in the shunning? I mean, did you feel like, well, hey, let's go explore some more of this, the world out here. I'm shunned. I don't have anyone up here. What's tying me to this place?
I think that there was an element of that. I don't think that it was so much, let me explore the depths of depravity that the world has.
No, I didn't mean that. I just meant
no, I didn't take it that way.
Yes,
but
okay.
just to be clear. But I think that what it was that I had a very small reality for the time that I was in. And that I understood that I had been lied to fundamentally regarding a lot of what life is like, and that I wanted to forge those experiences for myself. That I had accepted that there might be times when it would be difficult or challenging, but I had the confidence that nothing that I would experience in those adventures would compare to the pain that I had experienced while I was in. And I still hold that to be true. Lives are filled with joy and pain, typically not in equal measure, but there's no hardship that I've experienced that came close to comparing to what I experienced while I was in.
Wow, that says a lot. It's very true. I understand that as well. So where would you like to pick back up? Would you like to pick back up with you exploring the world as you were going through the States and experiencing homelessness and all of these things, and then where your life goes from there?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I did that travel. I came back home about a year later. I had a lot of really interesting, formative experiences during that travel, during experiencing homelessness. I learned a lot of empathy during that time. I also kind of learned some of the dark underbelly of the civilization that we live in. I think that that's another disservice that the cult provides, is not giving us a realistic view of what it is like to live in Western civilization. We have the perception that, you go in field service, you say, oh, that big house, that's going to be mine after Armageddon. And so you kind of have this perception that it's a lot of wealthy people, except for the ones who are like doing black magic and, heroin or whatever. So getting to really see what the United States was like from the ground up was absolutely educational. But I kind of had come to the end of that run and needed to kind of regroup. I had no desire to experience homelessness for extended periods of time. I wasn't afraid of it. But when I found myself in Florida, it was a lot different than spending time in, Tucson, Arizona, Tempe, Arizona. New Orleans in particular was not a bad place to be homeless as far as places go. But I knew that I didn't want that to be my entire life. So I came back to Alaska and I began pursuing a career. What was really interesting for me, though, is moving from being a person who is experiencing homelessness to a person who, at 19 was working at a credit union. I was exposed to the way that a person's physical appearance inspires judgment from the general population. And that rhymed so closely with a lot of the judgmental attitudes that I had experienced within the Jehovah's Witnesses, which I found profoundly disturbing. And it took me many years to process through that as well. So I worked for a credit union for a short period of time. Very quickly, I moved into political organizing, drug law reform in particular. It should come as no surprise that someone who has raised Jehovah's Witness and gone through field ministry is great at collecting petition signatures and leafleting for political action. So I did that for about 5 years with an emphasis in drug law reform. But I also worked on some environmental actions as well, which was, very interesting, very satisfying. And that kind of walked me into the place where I got that big chunk of therapy. I was anesthetizing really heavily. I was drinking pretty heavily. I had a partner who had also been exposed to the witnesses, although had not had the same experience as I had. But they had an objectively far more traumatic family of origin experience. And they were coping in the ways that they had learned. And they ended up going to a treatment program, kind of a fancy high-end treatment program that we have up here, or had at the time. And they saw that I was deeply invested in my partner's development and that I was making great use of the resources that were, somewhat scant compared to their experience, but that were available to me. They ended up offering me a scholarship to the program, which was a $40,000 program, 30-day intensive outpatient, 9 months after that. And so I got a ton of therapy in a relatively short amount of time, which really kind of started to get me on the path towards mental health and being a lot better adjusted as an individual than I had been before.
That's really nice that you got to have that scholarship. offer.
So lucky.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. It's not hyperbole that it saved my life.
Sure.
In fact, you had asked earlier about friends that I had during that kind of adolescent, pubescent period. I told you about the two who were like, kind of their parents were not great witnesses. And one of those people is no longer with us because he very effectively drank himself to death. Very directly and effectively drank himself to death. And so, even if it had not been by a direct specific action, hindsight being 2020, there's no doubt in my mind that the risky behavior that I was engaging in, along with the substance abuse issues, that was, a direct result of anesthetizing the trauma, that I would have been dead before 30. There's no question in my mind.
Well, glad you got help. And I'm so
Thank
sorry
you.
that there are others out there that maybe don't have access to it, aren't ready for it, very traumatized, whatever the case may be. It's just Jehovah's Witnesses like to talk about the fruitages that they produce, and they leave out a whole lot of things that they don't want to talk about.
Yes, they do. And I think that that's really interesting. I've gone back and forth in my own mind about relative value of confronting people that are in or confronting the organization on doctrinal inconsistencies. I've largely come away feeling that it wouldn't be a productive exercise. But with that being said, that's definitely something that I think about a lot, is like, oh, I'll know you by your fruits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that's a bitter fruit coming from that tree. And it causes a lot of harm. And so it tells me a lot about the validity of your belief system.
Yeah. Abuse, suicide, and absolutely destroyed families.
Destroyed families. Yeah.
Completely. Are much of the fruitage that they don't like to talk about. And
that's right.
It's really, really horrendous. So I'm glad. So you end up going through this program. It, as you said, effectively saves your life. Where do you go from there?
That's a great question. So something I think that's worthwhile to comment on is that therapy didn't fix me.
Sure.
Therapy gave me tools in my toolbox that I could use to more effectively manage both previous and ongoing experiences that I'd had. So it's not a magic wand, but it was incredibly beneficial to my process. So yeah, that brings me up to about 25. And I think that that's in a lot of ways when my adulthood really started. Although, like any nascent adulthoods, not without challenges. Right around then, I moved to Lansing, Michigan, right at the beginning of the recession. And for those who don't know, Lansing, Michigan's economy was based on the GM plants, and closing the plants was a symptom / cause of that recession. So I'd moved to what became an extremely economically depressed area. But that's also when I found one of my major career paths that kind of led me through to where I am today. I got my first job in technical support. Surprise, surprise, that I should find a profession telling people what to do in a way that helps them to feel like they're not being told what to do. But yeah, I got involved in technical support, and that was the beginning of a fairly long and successful career in that space, with no degree and a GED, and being able to just go in and kind of forge it from the ground up. That is also where I met my first wife, who I still think of as an absolute peach. It didn't work out, as adult relationships oftentimes do not. So I lived in Lansing, Michigan for about 5 years, Pretty uneventful from that perspective. It was during that time that my mom formally left the church. I think that she faded technically, but she did contact my dad to let him know that he was free to remarry, which he then did in fairly short order. And my dad and his new wife did attend my wedding, which I was happy for and surprised by, although we exchanged maybe 2 or 3 words during that. Interestingly, my best man sat between my mom and my dad at the head table because I wanted both of them at the head table. They were both my parents, after all.
Sure.
So I can only imagine how uncomfortable that was for him. They had not seen each other.
That's got to be rough.
They hadn't seen each other, since she had left. So that was certainly exciting. A beautiful wedding, beautiful ceremony, a beautiful bride. Let's see here. I began working in insurance a little bit, kind of leveraging that call center experience to move into health insurance servicing over the phone. And then shortly after that, I went and did property claims adjusting after Katrina, Rita, and Ike. At the end of that, my wife and I moved to Austin, Texas, where I lived for the better part of about 20 years, 15 years total, I guess. And worked in construction for a short period of time, and then began working with a tech giant in the area. Had a pretty good career with them, and then kind of just continued to work in the tech sector for a number of years.
Okay. And so you've had these years since. So today, how long has it been since you, I guess, officially left or not baptized anymore, or whatever you want to call it?
Almost exactly 25 years.
Wow. Okay.
Almost exactly
25 years. And what have you been able to keep any meaningful relationships during that time?
So
that were threatened by the witnesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have the short answer is no.
Okay.
I have attempted to rekindle a relationship with my father. I have an okay relationship with my mom and my sister, but of course they're out. I have a amicable relationship with the auntie who put me in contact with my sister way back when. She's great. We all experience our issues. I support them all as people, but I think that kind of I don't know exactly how to describe it, but there's, with many people, I think a certain tone to engaging with family members, or like a sheen on the relationship, where you don't necessarily see them as just ordinary humans first and foremost. You see them as a family member or something like that first and foremost. I don't really experience that. I see the family members that I have contact with as human beings that deserve empathy, deserve love. I think everyone deserves love. But we're not close, if that makes sense.
Oh, completely.
I've also made several attempts to have some sort of a relationship with my dad, which has gone fairly poorly. There have been times when I've been more successful with it. When I was about 30, we had another attempt at it. But the issue was that he couldn't stop proselytizing, trying to convert me.
Of course.
And that's extremely triggering for me. Extremely triggering. I drew a boundary with him. Told him I love him. I love that we're talking. I love these conversations, but I can't be in a conversation where you are trying to convert me. It makes me really uncomfortable. and I can't tolerate it. So if you do it, then I just have to end the conversation then and there.
Mhm.
And the first time that he did it, I held my boundary, and then we did not talk for many years, almost 10 years.
Well, I'm sorry that that was his reaction, but good for you for setting and holding to your boundary, even though it's hard to do.
Yeah, it was very painful and very disappointing. Just absolute vulnerability and openness here. I had always really, I think in some ways, projected an expectation on him of what a father could or should be.
Mhm.
I've learned a lot in recent years about how that's really kind of setting a person up for disaster. If you hold someone in this platonic ideal, then nobody's going to be able to fulfill that.
Sure.
Whereas if you
Idealizing.
can understand that they're human and love them for who they are, not for who you wish they would be, that's typically a lot healthier of an approach. I still fall prey to it. I still wish that, like when I was going through a divorce with my first wife, I called him and I asked him for support, and his response was, well, anything that I tell you is going to be from the Bible, and I know you don't want to hear that, so I got nothing to tell you. And that was a very disappointing response that caused me a lot of pain. And I held on to that pain for a long time. And I think that my expectation isn't unreasonable, but at the same time, it is an expectation that I held that was divorced from the reality of the situation that I found myself in.
Well, true. It's okay to have your own expectations of how you be treated, especially, I mean, it's not like your dad was very abusive growing up.
Yeah.
So you don't have, like that's not
Yeah.
just the opposite of idealized. That's actively abusive, and you don't have to tolerate that just because that's who he is.
Oh, no. Yeah, 100%.
And
So,
you get to
that
determine it.
there's been complexity trying to form a relationship with him on terms
Sure.
that make sense to both of us as adults. When I moved back up here, I had certainly hoped that, geographical proximity would contribute. And I think that to a certain extent it has. But I've had a really complex spiritual journey and spiritual life also. So just recently, I actually had a second coming out to my dad. The first one was that I did not identify as a Jehovah's Witness. This one was that I now again identify as a theist. So coming back to him and saying, hey, I do believe, I have a rich spiritual life. I have a rich prayer life. I believe in the concept of divinity. I understand you probably don't want to talk about it, but the fact that I have a spiritual life and a rich prayer life, I hoped that it might bring you some comfort, because I know that you're upset by the fact that I'm not a Jehovah's Witness and will never be a Jehovah's Witness again. And his response, I think, was very telling, because he went directly into radio silence. Well, that's not true. He went directly into the conversion script again. And when I told him that I don't believe that Paul was divinely inspired, then that immediately triggered radio silence. We had been texting once or twice a week. There was nothing for several months. I reached out to his wife to say, hey, I think that it really sucks that, I shared this thing that was intended to provide some encouragement, and my response is to effectively be shunned all over again. I don't think that's really fair. And so he's given like a little bit of lip service towards doing that, but he is definitely scared to talk theology with me.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So I wonder, would he prefer that you don't believe at all?
I think
Is it
so.
more threatening that you believe, but believe differently than him?
So I think that, and this is a fear that I have also, I think that it's likely a fear that he shares, because for me, it was always one thing to be shunned or, disfellowshipped or anything along those lines. I have tried to be very careful to not be branded an apostate,
Hmm.
because that brings in a whole other level of shunning. My dad, for example, he had a severe medical issue some years back. He was in ICU for several weeks, and I wasn't notified of his medical emergency until after he was out of the hospital,
Mhm.
even though he had people from his congregation in attendance before he made it to the hospital, right? And my feelings were hurt by that, but at least I got some health information that something had happened. I would be really sad if I didn't get notification of his passing because I'd been branded an apostate.
So, well, you already are an apostate simply by believing differently than them. That's how Jehovah's
Sure,
Witnesses
sure, sure.
see it,
But I don't
right?
think that I've gotten like the official
Yeah,
designation. I don't think I
I
get
got
the
that.
merit badge for it.
I got that. But
Yeah.
I think that your example there points out something that's very poignant, and then that is that your dad was in the hospital and he had Jehovah's Witnesses there, but he didn't have you there, or
Yep.
didn't let you know about it. And that's because your dad, first and foremost, your dad's not your dad. Your dad's
Right.
one of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's who
100%.
he is. That's his identity. His identity
Right.
isn't your father. His identity is elder in the congregation, Jehovah's Witness. Takes precedent
Right.
over everything.
And that's kind of what I was speaking to when I talk about managing my own expectations with regards to our relationship. One of the things that really cut me the deepest was that when I was going through that treatment program that I told you about, towards the end of it, there was a family night. And this had been a profound experience for me. I invited him, he accepted, he committed to coming, and then didn't show up with no notice. Like, I was the stereotypical kid standing at the back of the theater, looking at the door every time it opened, only to have no one walk through for them. And I found out later that someone in the congregation had needed their furnace tinkered with. And so he went and he did that instead. It was very hurtful, but it also was of value because it let me know again where I stood with him.
Yeah, and that cuts too. So a lot of us are trying to have relationships with an idealized version, as previously mentioned, of our parents, projecting maybe our greatest moments or best moments with them into, well, maybe this is who they are, and we can get that when that's just not reality.
Yes.
But also the other side is true, and that is that we're trying to have relationships with people who aren't people, they're an organization.
Right.
We might, it's like we're trying to have a relationship with jw.org, with a non-personal entity, a website, because our parents, they often don't have their own thoughts and feelings and stuff such to share. All they can project is a reflection of jw.org, and they just don't have anything else to offer. There is no parent there with whom to have a relationship for many of us. Not everybody, but for many.
So I think that that's really interesting, and it's pretty canny because when I came out to my dad about, kind of my spiritual development, it was so clear that his response was directly regurgitated from the literature.
Oh, yes.
And I'm sure that he thought that he was being clever or sneaky by doing a copy paste. Even if the formatting had been edited correctly, it still would have been so transparent that it was jw.org talking points that were being spat out through it.
Yes, I have seen and been privy to many people's personal writings between them and family members as they are trying to have some sort of a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it is uncanny how many times the same phrases are parroted over and over and over again. You know,
Right.
everyone's trying to have a relationship with their parents who are not individuals. They are just parroting the talking points of the brainwashing that they have experienced through the cult. There's not a vulnerable, real human being to talk to. You might as well be talking to like a JW.org developed AI chatbot that gives you all the talking point answers from the organization.
I almost wish that is who I had been talking to, because, so here's the thing is, if JWs were good with boundaries, one, they wouldn't work as an organization, right?
No, not at all. No.
But two, it would take away a lot of the fear that I think we survivors have in engaging with them.
Sure.
Because I'm willing to make some modest personal sacrifices to have a relationship with my dad. I'm getting older. I'm 43. He's in his 80s. I would love to not have a contentious relationship with him when he passes, right? I think that would be really, really nice for both of us. So when I approached the conversation with him about, my spiritual life, I actually referred him to a method that's used to communicate ongoing and enthusiastic consent as a way for him to communicate his boundaries around it. It's called the stoplight method. If anyone's not familiar with it, it's amazing. Basically, green means everything's good, maybe even more of the same. Yellow means I'm a little uncomfortable. We need to take a pause, but the interaction can continue largely as it has been. Red means full stop. I can't continue this conversation. It has to stop immediately, and we can go into a discussion of something else if it's appropriate. And so I introduced him to that concept, hopefully as a way to protect the relationship while having a conversation about something that was pretty loaded. And I was disappointed, although thankfully not terribly surprised, to discover that the boundaries that he's not great with are not just other people's boundaries, but his own. Communicating his boundaries is not one of his particular skills.
No, and you're asking, when you're asking for boundaries are a give and take, and Jehovah's Witnesses just take.
Yeah.
There's no giving. They are not, you are willing to, as you said, at some measure of sacrifice, try to bend. They are not willing to bend at all. They are completely rigid.
Right. Yeah,
there is
100%.
no bending.
Yeah. And, this is not really who I am as a person, but I admit to fleeting fantasies of approaching them with the same tone as they approach other people. Because even, and I'm not suggesting that, this is an objective truth or anything like that, but even within their own belief system, there are so many inconsistencies, much less if you remove the context of like the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and just talk about the New Testament. The inconsistencies are wild when you look at, that account of what Jesus' life was like and compare it to what Jehovah's Witnesses act like.
True.
I don't see Jehovah's Witnesses out providing material support for sex workers.
No, they don't even provide
the most reviled
for your
Well,
average child in the neighborhood who's struggling. They provide no
exactly.
support to anybody.
Yeah, which is not what I took from the Gospels.
Yeah, and they certainly wouldn't, like Jesus did to, as you said, sex workers. They would never
Yeah.
do that. No.
Or the most reviled, right?
No. They would
Yeah.
shun them instantly.
Yes, clearly.
Their support is the Watchtower magazine.
Woof.
You know, that's
Yeah.
that's how they see it. You know, that their charity, their charitable donation to everybody is their proselytizing work. That's it. They're
Right.
not going to help otherwise.
Yep.
That is a good
100%.
contrast between Jesus in the Bible and how he helped people and what Jehovah's Witnesses do. Jehovah's Witnesses
Yeah.
don't follow that example at all.
Well, and what drives me crazy is you look at, some of the stories, and again, I'm not claiming this as objective truth, but as stories that have a lot of meaning for many people and for whom many people can learn some moral truths, perhaps, right? You look at it, and when was Jesus violent according to the biblical account? When he perceived that people were profiting from and building a wall between their spirituality, saying, "Hey, what are you doing here? You've turned my father's house into a house of bankers." And I think that that's pretty meaningful when we look at the way that Jehovah's Witnesses claim that anyone who doesn't believe precisely as they do is not able to have an authentic spiritual life or an authentic spiritual existence. And I think that that is pretty much exactly what the Pharisees did, according to that
100%.
account.
Yeah.
They built laws around that were oppressive to the people that nobody could maintain, and they got in the way of people being able to lead a spiritual life. And I think that's a crime. It's a war crime. No, I'm being a little silly there, but yeah, I'm pretty passionate about that.
Jehovah's Witnesses claim to be Christian, but when you look at who Jesus didn't come in with a book that was hidden from everyone else, like the Elder's Manual, right?
Right.
He didn't come in with a bunch of rules and regulations and
right, he struck them down, according to
he struck them down. Yeah, that's the opposite of what Jehovah's Witnesses make rules and regulations constantly.
I think if we were to apply a more technically correct term, we could call Jehovah's Witnesses Pauline rather than Christian. But that's a big conversation.
Yeah,
and this
it
is probably not the forum.
Interesting one, as I know someone who's a member of the Exclusive Brethren group, and they believe that their prophet is the modern day Paul, and there's a lot of reflection of Jehovah's Witnesses in that group, or I would say probably vice versa, from what I understand of the evolution of the Brethren group and the Witnesses. I believe the Witnesses came a little afterward and actually were influenced by a discussion that Darby had in the United Kingdom that Russell went to and got some of his ideology from. So, yeah, it's just really interesting when you see how all of these things play off of one another and how different it could be than other expressions of spirituality. And I know you found your own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been kind of a long path to get there. I mentioned that as a small child, I was a theistic Satanist. And then later on, I identified as an atheist for many years. Through that, I moved into a space of agnosticism, but it was right around there that I was able, and right around the time that I got all that therapy, that I realized, hey, I have this really intense theological education. Yes, it's skewed in many ways, but that doesn't remove the fact that I read a version of the Bible many times before I was 12 even. And I began to develop an academic interest, not just in Christianity, but in world religions in general. So from there, I was still so triggered by Christianity, anything biblical, that I began to pursue a folk religious practice, which was really interesting and different for me. I'm of Northern European descent. And so I began to explore, some of the indigenous religious practices of my ethnic background. And I found that there was some there. There was something to it for me, that it was connective in a way, not that I had been searching for, but I guess I would compare it to the first time I had paella. Was a squid ink paella, and I had never eaten squid ink before. But when I consumed it, even just in my mouth, my body was like, this iodine is amazing. This is so good. You don't get this anywhere. This is like very satisfying. And that was kind of what I began to draw closer to with the folk religious practice. As time went on, I started reading a lot along the lines of quantum mechanics and subjective reality. And so I began developing a personal belief system that over time I was able to bring in some concepts from, Christ's teaching and from Old Testament beliefs as well. I take all of them with a huge grain of salt, and I don't project them onto other people. I think that that's pretty core, that's a pretty huge learning from my family of origin and the experiences I had with the Jehovah's Witness Church. But at the end of the day, for all of the harm that they caused, one good thing that I took from that experience was a deep distrust of religious institutions and the desire to have an authentic, personal spiritual existence, spiritual belief system, way to relate to the world. And I think that for me was one of the biggest crimes that was done against me, was believing that I couldn't ever have that, or that wasn't appropriate, or that I couldn't be empowered to have my own spiritual life. I would never look down on someone who doesn't have that experience. My partner, my current spouse, they're not quite a Dawkins style atheist, but they're pretty atheisty, like pretty far down that path. And that's great for them. But I think that if a person really, does any amount of spiritual research and looks in their heart, that they'll see that there's no need for a church in that way, and that oftentimes churches are detrimental.
Anyone who knows me knows, or follows me knows that I am an atheist as well. But isn't it interesting that Jehovah's Witnesses used to talk a lot about having your personal relationship with Jehovah,
right?
But yet there was no individuality. There was no opportunity to ever have a personal relationship with a God, because nothing was truly personal. They owned you at every turn, and they told you exactly how you should think and what you should feel. So how could there, it was just a personal relationship. Like today I have personal integrity. I have integrity based on how I personally feel. But as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, they called it personal integrity, but it wasn't. My integrity was to the organization and exactly what they told me to be. And that was my relationship with any deity was, exactly what they tell me to do. Apparently that's how I'm personally supposed to do it.
Well, you know what it makes me think about? And, JWs are really big on like, oh, we don't use like written down prayers, like say like a Hail Mary or something like that. They're so
Yeah,
judgmental about it.
yeah.
But the nature of their relationship with the deity, I think of it as being like, if I had a spouse and the only way that I could communicate with them was by reading off this sheet of one of 20 prepared statements, and as long as I stay within that sheet, I'm allowed to have a personal relationship with my spouse. It makes about as much sense to me.
Yeah, and let's not pretend like Jehovah's Witnesses don't have rote prayers, because my dad said the same prayer for dinner like our whole life.
Oh,
As
100%.
someone who was a brother who gave prayers from the platform, there is a prescribed way that if you pay attention to it, that those prayers are to be offered and what you are to or not to speak about.
Oh,
They
sure.
absolutely have rote prayers.
Well, and even beyond that, the kind of the guardrails that they put on the nature of worship or engaging with the divine. What is that if not a rote prayer? When you're saying there's only really one way that you can have a relationship, a personal relationship with deity or with the concept of deity. And to be fair, which is not something that they offer us, but that's who I try to be as a person.
Understood.
That's not exclusive to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh, no, not at all.
So the irony of them decrying Christendom when fundamentally they are putting themselves in exactly the same camp, it just boggles my mind.
Just funny that you used the word fundamentally. I recently listened to there's a podcast called Stuff You Should Know, and
big fan.
I enjoy that. They had an episode recently on fundamentalism, just period, which obviously is going to include religious fundamentalism, but also other types as well. And just as they were talking about the fundamentals of fundamentalism, it just was Jehovah's Witnesses to a T, and so many other groups as well. But it was really interesting just to hear that in an environment where they weren't even trying to talk about Jehovah's Witnesses. They just, nailed it. That's what it is, right? And so it's interesting to look at all of this. I'm glad that you found your own path. Everyone should get the freedom to find the path that fits them, whatever that may be.
And I think that one of the things that's really interesting, and if anyone has felt afraid or been off-put, I'd like to comment on something that's supernatural. That is very natural.
I like that.
Which is that we have kind of hidden landmines in our minds and in our hearts that don't get uncovered until we step on them. I think back to, I dated someone very briefly who was also an ex-JW, but they were only like maybe 2 or 3 months out, and I was like 15 years out, something like that. And I was trying to get to know them as a person, and I was like, oh, hey, do you like horror movies? Because I love horror movies. I really do. I love horror movies.
Sure.
Not the splatter, not the jump scares, but I love monsters and stuff that takes place in Christian mythology, and all of that stuff is super fun for me. So I asked them, I'm like, hey, do you like horror movies? And she said, no, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness anymore, but I still believe in demons. And so I just don't want to invite that into my life. And I was respectful of it. I said, okay, fair enough. No problem. I just thought I would see if it was something you might be interested in. We could visit about. And 2 or 3 days later, they came back and they said, I don't know why I said that. I never really thought about it. I don't believe in demons. Like, I don't believe in demons. I've just never really seen horror movies, and I don't know. I'm not really super interested in it. Okay, fair enough. And that was a fine conversation.
Scared of something we've never experienced.
Right. But they hadn't prosecuted their beliefs,
right? Because
it wasn't something that had come up.
Right.
And when you begin to prosecute those beliefs, stuff comes up that you did not realize that you were still holding on to.
Oh, sure.
And then once you start to unpack it a little bit, it's like, oh no, that's actually a really gross belief that I held on to. I'm not shaming on anyone's sincerely held beliefs that don't harm other people. But yeah, it's just a wild thing. And that has been a part of my own belief journey, was that there were elements of the Jehovah's Witness doctrine that I didn't know was forming what I thought belief had to look like, or spirituality had to look like, right?
Sure.
And taking, for example, belief in the entire biblical canon.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people look at 2 Timothy 3:16 and they're like, that means that the Council of Nicaea was right, even though 2 Timothy 3:16 happened centuries before the Council of Nicaea. I still, because it says it in, 2 Timothy, I have to believe that in order to believe in a deity or to believe that Jesus Christ had a good message. Mm-hmm. And that's only true if you want it to be. We are the arbiters of our own reality.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. So you now have, did you say your spouse or your wife today?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm sorry. I couldn't remember. I was like, is this a spouse or partner? I didn't know how you addressed that.
Yeah. Both.
So, okay. So today, you have your own relationship on earth. You have your own spiritual walk as well. You are really kind of coming in more into your own, right? As you grow, which we all do over time. We're all works in progress. When you look back, and I guess, I don't know who, I often ask people, is there anything you would say to the people maybe who were left behind, or well, the people who stayed behind? You didn't leave them. So the people who stayed behind, is there anyone that you would have anything to say to, if you had something to say?
It's tough. I grew up with an expression. The expression is, it's like teaching a pig to dance. It doesn't do you any good, and it just annoys the pig. And so I think about that a lot in terms of how I would engage with people who had been part of my life before when I was in. I try to think about things that are pleasant and or productive, right? And if it's not in those two areas, I think really seriously if it's something that I want to say, because I find that a lot of times those exercises do more to drag me down than it does to have any type of an impact. I'm not trying to drag other people down. When I was young in my teens, I absolutely thought about like spraying pentagrams into their lawn with weed killer, that like over the process of days, like the grass would die and there's I support people who engage in that type of thinking because it's what they need to take back their personal power. Mm-hmm. With that being said, I wish that I could tell them that it doesn't have to be that way, but I don't think that they have any capacity to hear it.
No, they
right?
don't. They don't.
I wish that I could tell them that I've had a very fulfilling life. But I know that wouldn't have any impact on them. It wouldn't carry any meaning to them.
Fall on deaf ears.
Yeah. I think that if I were guaranteed to have them hear what I say, like really hear and have it resonate in their hearts and in their minds, I think that I would share with them the harm that they cause. That I would, not that I wish my pain that I've experienced on anyone else, but I wish that they could really see it and know the effects of the things that they say and do. Because, and maybe this is idealistic on my part, but in my heart of hearts, I believe that if it wasn't an abstraction that had been colored by the way that the society talks about it. Like if they really knew the pain that they're putting people through, they would be able to recognize that it's not what they say it is, and that it might inspire some changes.
True.
But apart from that, I have grown to understand that I am not for everyone in my personal life. And I've grown to be comfortable with that, right? There's no person who's for everyone.
That's a beautiful thing to be able to learn.
Yeah, it's been huge for me. And so when I think about like the relationships that I have or don't have as a result of the way that the Jehovah's Witnesses stepped all over my life from a very early age, in a lot of ways, I think that they did me a favor, because the people who stay in are making a choice, even if they're brainwashed, even if they're multi-generational like I was and they stay in. There comes a point in time when, as an adult, you have to take personal responsibility for the ways that you harm other people. That's my opinion. And so in a lot of ways, even though the way that I came to it was hurtful and harmful, they did me a huge favor, because the people who are acting like this and treating other people like this, they are not my friends and they are not my family. That's made manifest by their actions, by their choices. And I would rather have it be upfront and very plain than have them present a false face and have to discover it years later.
Yes.
So probably in a lot of ways, it would be an expression of gratitude.
I could see that. Sure.
Being
you showed yourself
open about
early
being
on,
bags of
and
shit. Yeah,
instead of playing this game for decades and decades and decades.
exactly.
Gotcha. So what do you enjoy about your life today? What's good for Arthur, and is there anything that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, there are so many things that bring me all kinds of joy. And I think that there's like this whole spectrum, because like giving my dog belly rubs.
Yeah.
But that's like a very primary, I love to cook, and that's a very satisfying thing.
It's the simple things that make for a very satisfying, happy life oftentimes.
Absolutely. So I don't want to like forget to mention that like I have a lovely spouse and a great dog, and wildflowers bring me joy. But also following my academic and theological passions, I hope to one day open a place where folks who are less economically advantaged can engage on spiritual retreats, because I believe that existing in nature is good for a person's heart, mind, and soul. And that if you're not wealthy, getting out of the city, getting away from money for a minute, and getting to whatever that looks like for you, whether it's meditation, prayer, ritual, affording folks opportunities for that, as well as providing safe havens for folks who are survivors of like high control religious organizations, not just Jehovah's Witnesses, but we see expressions of it in many religions.
Sure.
So that's a life goal that I'm working towards. I try to show kindness and grace to the people in my life, including myself. Not always great at it with myself. I love board games. I'm a big fan of backgammon, dominoes, cribbage, maybe not technically a board game. But yeah, I have a very full life. I'm currently blessed to be working on a theater project. I have no theater background whatsoever, but I'm getting to work on an opera that's near and dear to my heart. And I don't know, it's just very full.
Well, I'm glad that you've certainly made something out of something that wasn't. You made something beautiful out of something that started off not so beautiful, and I'm glad that you've put in that work. I know it wasn't easy, It never is. Healing is a process. Like you talked about the landmines as we go throughout our lives. Sometimes they pop up. But I'm glad that you've continued on that path and that now you have a beautiful life that you can be proud of. You deserve that.
Well, and like, yes, there was certainly a lot of heavy lifting on my part. But I also want to call out the benefit of folks like yourself, of organizations. A lot of times survivor groups can be very complicated. There are a lot of people who are at different stages of their recovery, and I understand that. And sometimes it can be difficult to be in those spaces, to see someone who is still struggling with some of the thought patterns that were injected into them for years, and now they're 2 weeks out and they don't know yet how to set those aside. That can be painful. But the online communities, podcasts, YouTube channels, I think that they can be really, really helpful. And I know that they've had a ton of value to me. Hopefully, if someone is listening to this, they are already availing themselves of all of those resources. You mentioned ex-JW, Reddit is huge. I also like to engage with Exmo, like former Mormon resources, because those experiences can be so parallel. But I just would like to express some gratitude for the work that you do, because it's meaningful, and I believe it saves lives.
Oh, I appreciate that, Arthur.
I wish that these resources had been around while I was hacking my way through the jungle. You know what I mean?
I totally understand. And one of the things that I've always tried to do is to be the person that I wish I would have had or could have had when I was leaving, or whatever the
100%.
case may be. And so I think that working together, we can all make a difference in our own ways. Like just like today, here you are telling your story, and it'll make a difference for others who get to hear it as well. And so now you get to add yourself to the list. And so I appreciate
Wow.
you, being a part of it. It's cool.
Well, that's very kind of you. It would make me happy if somebody heard this and found it relatable, or found a freedom from bondage that they had not realized that they're in. I believe really strongly in, self-analysis, as long as it's productive and healthy and not necessarily circular, but like really unpacking our experiences and questioning, whoa, that's an interesting thing that I just thought. Do I believe that? Okay, if I do, why do I believe that? What is that rooted in? And what's the effect that it has in my life? Is that beneficial? Or is it something that I really need to spend some time working on and see if it's something I want to keep around? Because you don't have to.
Absolutely. A little self-CBT.
Correct.
Yes. All right. Well, I appreciate you doing this. Look forward to, I'm sure there will be lots of comments or people who have been impacted by your words today too, and your experience. And I appreciate you sharing that.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Michael. It's been a real pleasure.